Imagine you're an 8-year-old horror fan in 1989. You love Friday the 13th, you finally get your hands on the official NES game. And within minutes, you're throwing rocks at zombies, wandering around aimlessly, and getting your ass handed to you by a purple Jason. The late 80s were a gold rush for movie-licensed games. Developers didn't need to make something great, just something that sold. And no company knew this better than LJN. The same publisher that butchered Back to the Future, Jaws, and X-Men also got their hands on one of horror's biggest franchises. But instead of a tense, terrifying slasher experience, we got, well, whatever this is. So, how did this happen? How do you turn one of the scariest horror villains of all time into a side-scrolling scavenger hunt? Today, we're diving into the story of Friday the 13th for the NES, how it was made, why it's so different from the films, and whether it's truly one of the worst games of all time, or just misunderstood. When horror fans think of Friday the 13th, they imagine a relentless killer stalking his victims through the eerie woods of Camp Crystal Lake. The franchise's legacy is built on suspense, gore, and the unstoppable force of Jason Voorhees. However, the 1989 NES adaptation of Friday the 13th delivered an experience that was anything but terrifying. Instead of a straightforward slasher game, players were given a perplexing mix of exploration, cryptic puzzles, and awkward combat mechanics that felt more at home in a strange RPG than a horror title. Developed by Atlas and published by LJN, the game has since gained a reputation as one of the most baffling adaptations of a film franchise in gaming history. By the late 1980s, licensed movie games had become a major trend in the video game industry. Publishers saw the potential to capitalize on popular films, bringing recognizable franchises to the rapidly growing home console market. LJN, a company infamous for its rushed and often poorly received licensed games, acquired the rights to Friday the 13th, hoping to bring the horror of Camp Crystal Lake to the NES. Given the console's limitations and the need to make the game accessible to younger audiences, developers had to take creative liberties with the source material. Rather than focusing on an authentic slasher experience, they opted for an action-adventure hybrid, attempting to translate Jason's menace into a survival-based gameplay loop. Unfortunately, the result was a game that, while ambitious in concept, ultimately failed to capture the essence of the films. One of the biggest criticisms of the Friday the 13th NES game is how drastically it diverges from the films. The movies revolve around Jason Voorhees systematically hunting down unsuspecting counselors in gruesome fashion, yet the game takes a different approach, turning Friday the 13th into a side-scrolling action-adventure with strange RPG elements. Instead of experiencing the terror of Jason's stealthy attacks, players take control of camp counselors tasked with defending children from his relentless assaults. The structure is more akin to a resource management and endurance test. Perhaps the most glaring difference is Jason himself. In the films, he is a silent, looming presence that strikes with brutal efficiency. However, in the game, he appears at random, almost like a mini-boss battle, engaging in awkward first-person boxing-style combat. This bizarre interpretation of Jason, where he moves back and forth throwing predictable punches, undermines his status as a terrifying villain. His unpredictability in the movies is what makes him terrifying, whereas in the game he simply becomes another enemy to fight repeatedly. Another major deviation is the inclusion of supernatural enemies. The films, at least until later sequels, focus on a more grounded slasher villain, but the game populates Camp Crystal Lake with zombies and other monsters that constantly attack the player. This decision makes the game feel more like a fantasy horror adventure, rather than an adaptation of a slasher film. There is no real sense of dread or suspense, just repetitive enemy encounters and confusing exploration. Unlike the straightforward survival premise of the films, Friday the 13th presents players with an unexpected challenge, controlling one of 6 camp counselors as they attempt to protect Crystal Lake's children while fending off Jason himself. The game is structured as an open-ended, side-scrolling adventure, with the campgrounds and its surrounding locations serving as the primary setting. Players must traverse cabins, forests, and caves, all while managing the limited capabilities of each counselor. Each character has slightly different strengths and weaknesses, though the differences are often negligible due to the game's clunky movement and frustrating hit detection. The combat is perplexing. Players start with weak weapons like rocks, which follow an awkward arc rather than flying straight, making them difficult to aim. Upgrading to better weapons, such as the torch or the machete, requires completing specific tasks that are neither intuitive nor explained, leaving players to stumble upon progress rather than earn it through skill. Enemies, including zombies, wolves, and crows, feel out of place, adding a supernatural element that was largely absent from the Friday the 13th films at that time. Despite its myriad of flaws, Friday the 13th has developed a cult following, much like other notorious LJN published games. Its reputation as one of the most frustrating and misleading horror adaptations in gaming history has made it a frequent subject of retrospectives, often held up as an example of how not to translate a horror film into a video game. However, for those willing to embrace its bizarre mechanics and punishing difficulty, there is a certain charm in its oddity. The haunting 8-bit soundtrack, while repetitive, creates a fun atmosphere, and the tension of Jason's unpredictable appearances, though clunky, does evoke a sense of danger. That said, Nintendo Power Magazine in its September 1997 issue ranked Friday the 13th as the 6th worst game ever made. The reviewer harshly criticized its frustrating mechanics, stating, "After playing a few minutes of this aardvark, you wanted Jason to slaughter all the counselors and then you. Anything so it would just end." Friday the 13th for the NES stands as a cautionary tale of how a popular horror franchise can be misinterpreted in video game form. Instead of delivering a visceral, tense survival horror experience, the game leans into obscure mechanics, baffling design choices, and a combat system that is more frustrating than frightening. While it remains an intriguing relic of late 80s gaming, its legacy is not one of horror excellence, but of perplexing game design that still puzzles players decades later. At the end of the day, Friday the 13th on the NES isn't just a bad horror game. It's a weird, fascinating relic of a time when movie licenses were slapped onto whatever developers could cobble together. It completely misses the tone of the films. Jason fights like a punch-drunk boxer, and the scariest thing about it is the map screen. But for all its flaws, it still managed to carve out a legacy. Maybe not as a great game, but as one of the most infamous horror adaptations in video game history. And really, isn't that kind of fitting for a series that refuses to die?